Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So in here, I'm going to discuss the program translators, right? So this is continuation of this lesson number one. In here, first one is source code. Source code means the series of statements which are written in programming language, right? And then computer programming means the writing the process of writing, testing the program, and maintaining the source code of the computer programs. All right. So first we have to write the code, and then you have to test it whether the requirements are made, how the program is correct, and then we have to maintain those programs. Right. So that is what we call computer programming. Right. And then source code cannot be directly understood by the computer. Right. So this is a code which is given in programming language called Java. Right. So this code cannot be directly understood, or this code cannot be directly executed by the computer, or basically we call computer processor. Right. So in here there's an example. Right. So for example, in here this lecturer doing the lecture in a singular medium, right? So by assume these students don't know singular, then can they understand this lecture? No, they can't understand, right? So assume they don't know the singular, right? So likewise, the CPU can only execute the machine codes, right? So the CPU can only execute the machine code. Then, therefore, source code must be converted into the computer understandable form. That is, the source code should be converted into the machine code before we execute, right? So we discussed it, right? So any programming language, right? So codes which are given in any programming language should be converted into the machine code before they execute, right? So otherwise, those code cannot be executed by the processor, right? So the machine code. So that is different computer platform have different machine languages. So for example, as I said earlier, IBM computer hardware use the particular machine code, which is different from the Apple computers, right? So that is the depending on the platform in the computer hardware, depending on the platform, the machine codes are different, right? So in here, say the Apple computers use different machine language than the IBM computers, right? So in programming, right? So for example, in here, now he is doing the lecture in English medium. Here, they can understand only single medium. Then they cannot understand this particular lecture, right? Then what we have to do? What we have to do? Right? So what we can do? So we have to translate this lecture series into the singular medium, right? So in here, right? So in high level language, right? So this is easy for programmer to understand, and then here they contain the English words. But the computer cannot understand the high level language, right? So computer can understand only the machine codes, right? So this is computer own language. So these are contents of the collection of ones and zeros. Then what we have to do, we have to convert this the instructions which are given in high level language into the machine code, right? So in order to do that, we can use a translators, right? Translator, all right? So the translation of the source code into the machine code can be done in two ways, right? So as I explained in earlier, there are two ways, right? So compiler or interpreter. So there are two kinds of translators, compilers and interpreter, right? So using the either compiler or interpreter, or in sometimes both, we can translate the higher language code into machine code, right? So in here, if it is translator, so they translate the statement by statement. So we call sentence by sentence, right? So there are two ways to translate a lecture into the another medium, right? So the first method is we can translate a sentence by sentence, right? Vakya, right? Sentence by sentence into the singular medium. In here it's a good morning. Here we translate that particular sentence in the singular medium. Then he explained another thing in what another sentence. Then that sentence is translated into singular. Likewise, we can translate sentence by sentence into the translation medium, right? And the next one is the compilation. right? The compilation means they translate the entire high-level language source code before the execution, right? They convert or they translate entire source code into the machine code at once, all right? So in interpretation or in interpreter, they translate the high-level language source code line by line at the execution time. All right. Okay, I'll explain again. Right. So in compiler, they translate entire source code or entire a lesson or entire lecture at once. All right. So they translate the entire lessons at once, like this. They translate entire code into the machine code at once. Right. So that is by compile. But in interpreter, they translate the line by line, right? So in here, they take the first line of the lecture and then translate. Then they take the next line and then translate. Then they translate line by line, right? Line by line. So this is the comparison of compiler and interpreter. The compiler convert entire source code into the machine code before the execution. But the interpreter does not convert entire source code at once. They convert line by line, or we call statement by statement. But the compiler, the machine code is executed only after all source code has been converted, because the compiler translates the entire source code at once. So after in our example, so in here in the compiler, so after the lesson, so after the lecture, right? So if it's a lecture, after the lecture, they convert that entire lecture into the a different medium at once. So that's about the compile, right? So in programming source code, so in here, entire source code compile or entire source code converted into the machine code at once, right? But if it is interpreter, that is different. If it is interpreter, they take the first sentence from the lecture and then convert into the translation medium. Then they take, so during the lecture, right? During the lecture. So once they complete first sentence, the interpreter convert the a translation medium. Then this lecturer explain the second sentence. Then he convert into the translation medium. Likewise, the interpreter convert line by line, line by line. The interpreter does not wait for the end of the lecture. So end of the code. They take the first one and they convert. Then they take the second one and convert. Right. So the interpreter does not wait for the end of the lecture, but the compiler is wait for the end of the lecture, and then they convert entire source code or entire lesson at once. In terms of computer programming, they take entire source code and then convert it to the machine code. They take entire source code and convert it into the machine code. But in here, they take the first line of the source code and then convert. They take the second line of the source code and then convert. Likewise, the interpreter convert line by line, right? So I think this is very clear, right? So here, if it is source code, it's a compiler. The compiler take the entire source code and then convert into the executable code, then processor execute it. But interpreter, they take the first line of the source code and convert it and execute. Then interpreter takes the second line of the source code and convert into the executable code and execute it. Likewise, interpreter take line by line from the source code and convert and execute. But compiler take entire source code at once and convert into the executable program, and then that executable program will be executed by the processor. So that is the difference between compiler and interpreter. Right? So you have to identify the difference between compiler and interpreter. Right? So there are some advantages and disadvantages of the translator. Right? So here are some advantage of the compiler. Right? So in compiler, the whole program is validated, so there is no system errors. because compiler take entire source code at once and convert it into the machine code, right? Then the executable file is enhanced by the compiler, so it runs faster. So user do not have to run the program on same machine it was created. All right. So user can run that programming on the machine, right? So here are some disadvantages of the compiler. So it is slow to execute as you have to finish the whole program, and then it is not easy to debug as errors are shown at the end of the execution, right? So we have to correct all the errors before execution, right? Because uh, compiler take entire source code, then we have to correct errors which are in entire source code before execution the entire program, right? So in here the hardware specific, it works on specific machine language and architecture, right? So that means if it is difficult architecture, we have to convert again, right? So here are some advantages of the interpreter, right? So we have already discussed what are the advantages and disadvantages of the compiler, right? So these are the advantages of the compiler. So these are the disadvantages of the compiler, right? Then we discussed what are the advantages of the interpreter, right? So in here you discover errors before complete the program because the interpreter take line by line. Then we can correct line by line, right? Then we don't need to correct all the statements at once because the interpreter take line by line. But if it is compiler, we have to correct all the statements at once, right? So in here, programmer can be run before it is completed, so get partial results intermediate. So program does not need to complete before it run because here program run line by line, right? So in our programming, right, so we can complete line by line, complete the first line and check it, complete the second line and check it, right? Likewise, interpreter take line by line, right? Because of interpreter take line by line, right? So you can work on small parts of the program and link them later into the whole program, right? So we can complete a small part by part, right? And then finally we can link them to the whole program, right? So what are the disadvantages to the interpreter, right? So there is a possibility of syntax errors on unverified scripts, right? So here program is not enhanced and may encounter data errors, right? So program is not enhanced because they take line by line and complete it, right? So it may be slow because of interpretation is every execution, right? In every execution, we have to do the interpretation, right? So because in here they take line by line, but in compiler case, right? Compiler take whole program and convert it into machine code. Then machine code is remain, right? Okay, so here are some advantages of assembler. All right, so in assembler they have a symbolic operation. So the symbolic program is easier to understand, time saving for the programmer, right? So it is easy to fix errors and alter the program instruction, right? So the efficiency in execution just like machine language. So the efficiency of the execution using the assembly language is far better than the other or the high level language programming codes, right? So these are the disadvantage of the assemblers, right? So it is the machine dependent, right? So can be used in any other architecture, right? And then small change in the design can invalidate the whole program, right? So this is very difficult to maintain, right? So those are the disadvantages, right? So as a summary, right? So in programming languages, there are two levels, right? So low level and high level. So low level are two generations, first generation and second generation. First generation, we have machine language. In second generation, we have assembly language. If it is machine language, the processor or the computer can directly execute it. If it is assembly language, we have to use translator called assembler. By using the assembler, we can convert into the machine code. In high level languages, right? So we can have three generations, right? So in generally in high-level languages, we have to convert those programming code into the machine codes, right? There are two translators we call compiler and interpreter. You know how to execute compiler and interpreter and the differences of the comparison between compilers and interpreter, right? So usually low-level languages are closer to the computer than the programmer, and then source code translated into machine language by assembler. If it is assembly language, if it is machine language, no need to translate it, right? So if it is high-level programming languages, so they are closer to the human language, further from the machine languages, and then source code should be translated into the machine language by using compiler or interpreter, right? So that's the summary of this lesson, all right? And then what are the features of high-level languages, right? So in here, the translation is required, right? And then in here, easy to read, right? And maintain the software programming, right? So here we allow access to modular libraries, all right? And then here, use logic operations and function which are built in language, right? So we can use these features in later, right? So when you are doing the programming, all right? So in higher languages, we have variables, arrays, loops, and then some functions, right? Threads, locks. Actually, we have to study these concepts in higher languages. Here we use the C programming language. So let's see how to use variables, arrays, loops, and all those things in C programming language. Okay, so there are some other features as well, right? So we use these features in our practical classes, all right? So then we have to consider what are the steps in writing programming, right? So right, when you write a program, right? So there are four general phases, right? So first one is specify the problem. So we have to identify what is the problem, and then we have to analyze those problems and break into the series of steps towards the solution. So we have to break the our problems into manageable components, all right? And then we can write the codes for each and every component. Then after the writing codes, we have to compile and then test the code by running using the relevant compiler or interpreter, right? So in here we use a C programming language, right? So in C programming they use a compiler, right? In C programming they use compiler. Okay, so this is the end of the second lessons.